Well, Happy New Year! And there is much to be hopeful about in 2026, many say, and I'm certainly one of them. But this year is also going to be an important one with much to be done, because 2027 has been called the year of the Polycrisis, a scenario where all our geopolitical fears could align and pose a mortal threat to our already rocking world order. So will we be ready for it? Welcome to The General and the Journalist. I'm Tom.
And I'm Patrick. So those of you who've been listening for a while might recall that Tom and I used this expression polycrisis back in June in our episode on the Strategic Defence Review, where we sketched out very briefly a nightmare scenario where we could find ourselves facing war simultaneously on multiple fronts, so against China, against Russia, and possibly Iran and North Korea. And Tom even then wrote an article about it for the Times. But I suspect that subliminally, I must have nicked this idea from our guest today, Sam Olsen, because he's written the definitive paper on this for Sibylline with his co-author, Justin Crump, who also, Sam, is an old friend of mine and was very briefly my tenant. We rented our house to him. Anyway, Sam, welcome back to the pod. It's great to see you again.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for coming, Sam.
And of course, Sam, you and I known each other. We served together in Afghanistan, where you were an intelligence officer, and we've seen each other on and off since then. Anyway, last time you were back on the pod back in the summer, you talked, I thought, very powerfully about how China effectively holds all the cards when it comes to rare earth elements and raw materials. And this notion that China effectively has a veto on Western or European rearmament because it controls not only 90% of the supply of refined rare earth minerals, but also increasingly can dictate the stockpiles as well. And that, of course, matters enormously because of our reliance on, whether, as you said, I think in that episode, the 450 kilograms of an F-35 that come from rare earths. I think it's 4 tons of a nuclear submarine that come from rare earths. So what I wanted to talk about today, or ask you about today, was to take that idea forward and develop this notion that you've written about around a polycrisis. A series of geopolitical, technological, economic shocks which can converge into a global crunch year. And you've talked about 2027 as the first time this scenario comes about. So, let's accept, I think, first of all, I think you write it about it, that this is a scenario. What's the value, first of all, in just presenting a scenario in its own right? Because you're not predicting, are you?
No, it's really impossible to predict because there are so many different elements in play that you can't say X or Y or Z is going to happen. But by laying out a scenario, it should give government and business planners a real kick in the behind to say, look, you might not have the 5-10 years you think you've got of peace. You might actually only have 18 months, 2 years before the balloon goes up. And what are you going to do to prepare for that? That is a much better position to be in than just assuming that things will continue the way that they have done for many years.
Okay, well, let's. Can you sort of very briefly, because I think we've got a lot to cover. First of all, just describe the scenario itself, because it's a series of interrelated scenarios. So just tell us the component parts of it, and then I guess why 2027.
Okay, so as briefly as I can, because I could talk about this for a long time, we've got a series of geopolitical issues going around the world, as we all know. China and Taiwan, Russia and Eastern Europe, and then you have the European and North American domestic political and social unrest, and then you have the issue of technology and the rise of AI, and a bunch of other things that are happening. And it's a bit like the film The Perfect Storm, which I'm sure you saw back in the day. If you've got one event happening, then most Western countries can deal with it. 2, things get a bit more difficult. But when you start having 3 or 4 major issues hitting you at the same time, that's when the boat capsizes. And I think that is our the risk that we really want to hammer home with this paper. And just quickly go through them. First of all, China and Taiwan. It is unbelievably clear to any China watcher that China is definite about its moves on Taiwan. Now, whether it moves next year or 10 years, that's a point of contention, I think. But the question is whether Xi Jinping is serious about Taiwan. Everyone agrees. And then we have Russia and Eastern Europe. Again, it's very clear that Putin has designs in Eastern Europe. And you both have talked about this very eloquently. And your cyber episode recently was great, looking at this the grey zone stuff that's happening. But there are also worries about him just literally sending tanks over. And I think you, General Patrick, spoke about this a while ago. What is the response if he puts his tanks 100 yards into Estonian territory and then sits back behind his nuclear umbrella and says, come on then, what are you going to do? So one event, again, maybe we can sort of see how Europe and North America can work together on, for example, if Russia moved on Poland or, God forbid, any of the other countries there, and China and Taiwan were not happening and they were still sort of just bumbling along. But what happens when, and this is the point of our paper, when China moves on Taiwan with a big quarantine operation and really puts America in the spotlight in terms of its response, and at the same time Russia moves on, say, Poland, then we've got a very, very significant problem, because what that would require is both sets of issues to be pushed back on by a cohesive Western response. And we've already seen, we know that there are problems with anticipating Trump coming to Europe's rescue and Europe fully supporting the US and pushing back on China. And so that's the big sort of picture. But it gets even worse, because when you start looking at the things that would happen around it, for example, a massive economic shock. So if Taiwan is taken out of the picture because of a quarantine and it can't export its chips, then we would see a huge calamitous drying up of supply chain, chips into the supply chain, which would affect things in the UK and Canada and Australia and everywhere in Europe. 800,000 jobs in the UK, for example, rely on car factories. And those car factories simply cannot work without the chips. If you bring it all together, you can clearly see at the economic level, at the military level, at the political level, at the blockade/quarantine level in Taiwan, all these things coming together. How on earth do countries deal with that individually? Because I think that the final point of this is that if this does all blow up and it goes the way of China and Russia, then this is almost certainly the end of the US/Western-led order around the world.
Okay, great summary. And I still recommend that anybody who's listening goes down to the show notes. I'm sure that we'll embed the paper in there. But could you, you said Polycrisis 2027. Why 27? Why have you picked on this particular date?
The first reason is more prosaic, which is just that, first of all, America keeps saying that 2027 is when China will move in Taiwan, and they have done for years and years. And that came out actually because Admiral Davidson, when he was asked about 10 years ago when he thought China would move on Taiwan, guessed it would be about 2027. And that's now become folklore that it will be 2027. The problem with that is that China now thinks that America is planning on doing something in 2027, which means it's a self-reinforcing sort of assessment, which actually is based on one conversation from many years ago. And that is the problem with often with conflict and issues that happen. Yeah. They not necessarily always plan through. So that's one issue. Secondly, is that we know that Europe's trying to rearm at a pitifully slow rate, as we all would agree. And that rearmament process is nowhere near going to be ready by 27, 28. But you can look at 29, 2030, and you can see, maybe there will be some great strides happening. And then we look at America.
So it's a window of opportunity.
Yes, and then and the Americans haven't really properly rearmed. It's assessed that last year, 2024, the Americans only made 22 Tomahawk missiles, and any missile intensive conflict with China, all the estimates are a minimum of 5,000 Tomahawks would be used in the first 2 weeks.
Sam, sorry, let me just. I want to hear that one again. America manufactured 22 Tomahawk missiles in the last year.
Yes. And this is a really important point here, is that our military dependency on China is now so great from the supply chain point of view that actually the historian and strategist Phillips O'Brien said this, and I'm going to pinch it off him because it's a very good observation. But he said that the British and American armies now are in the same situation as the German and Japanese armies were in 1940. In other words, incredibly good at winning battles at the tactical and operational level, but strategically compromised because the raw materials and the components and all the inputs for the supply chains that are needed to keep those armies fighting for more than a few weeks are in the hands of their opponents. And that is the reality. And 2027, 2028 is basically the window of opportunity where China and Russia recognise that we haven't properly rearmed yet because we haven't built out all the supply chain redundancy that we need to replace China and particularly and Russia in some areas as well.
Which of these scenarios do you think is the most likely to start to be the catalyst?
I would suggest that China is very ready to move now. So if Russia did move on Estonia or Poland or whatever, then quickly rolling out their ships in a quarantine would probably take a matter of hours. So it's hard to know which one would start, but I would be surprised if one didn't take advantage of the other if it wasn't already coordinated.
You made a really interesting point that the current generation of leadership across the world are the boomer generation who were brought up in that wonderful era of peace as we look back on it now after the Second World War right up to now, and have no experiences of managing massive existential crises in the West at all. How much of that plays into this as a problem? And I guess the logical conclusion is obviously because they don't know about crises, they don't know about threat and existentialism, they haven't properly prepared for it because they can't see it as a reality. Is that about right? Where are you on that?
I would agree. I think one of the biggest problems for the West is that we have got so used to being the world leaders, and not just since 1945, but I would strongly argue that the world order we live in now should be termed the Anglo-American world order and has basically been in place since 1815 or so. So that's 200 years of Western/Anglo-American leadership. And there is also another problem, which is that the Americans especially have convinced themselves that so much of what we take for granted as our political philosophy, that the underlying political philosophy for the West, which is democratic freedom, freedom generally, and liberal values, they are universalist values. And as someone that's travelled to 75, 80 countries, I speak a number of languages, and I've lived and worked in more than a dozen countries, I can see how the universalist values that I was taught when I studied anthropology as an undergraduate, they just aren't there around the world, especially now, because you have China really ripping up the rule book and saying, you don't need to be a democracy to really make to make your networks, or to build out your TV networks or your broadband networks or whatever it is, and delivering on development that many of these countries want and demand. And so this source of legitimacy that the West thinks that it has by being a liberal values bloc is sort of being challenged now. And therefore, the universalism of our values is under threat. And that may sound a bit esoteric and a bit sort of wishy-washy, but I think it's really important, because if you're sitting there in London or Berlin or Washington, well, perhaps not Trump, but other people in Washington, and you think, well, it's obvious that the whole world should be liberal and should be democratic. And these are the universalist tendencies of mankind. And therefore, anyone going against it is A, wrong and a bit weird, and B, is destined to failure, because obviously democracies always win in the end. I think that this is a state of mind that is still gripping most Western policymakers and governments. And this is...
It's a failure of imagination.
Yes, it is. And I think it's a bit of a comfort blanket, because you're like... if what I'm saying is true, if our political philosophy is right, and therefore the world is eventually going to end up as a liberal democracy, which that famous paper by Francis Fukuyama at the end of history in the early 1990s, where he said, look, the West is one and the whole world is heading to be a liberal democracy. If you believe that in your heart, which I would argue most Western leaders still do, then what China's doing, what Russia's doing, it's a bit of an abhorrence. And actually, we can just ride the storm and everyone will go back, revert to the norm and revert to the universalist values that the whole world obviously holds. I disagree that that is the case. I think that the leaders in the West are, to be frank, deluded, that they don't see that the world is changing for the first time in a really big way for 200 years, that China especially, but Russia, Iran and other countries that are working with it are really in the driving seat now in terms of changing the world's political philosophies. And that means that Western leaders do not have the luxury of reckoning that this will just all pass. Things are changing, and they need to wake up.
Patrick, I've got a question for you. Of the military threats of the Polycrisis, breaking them down, so Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, as a general, you've studied these for years and years. Which of those four is the one that worries you the most?
Security begins at home. So as a British general, as a NATO general, what worries me most, not least because I think it's the most acute and proximate threat, is Russia. And we've talked several times on this podcast and with Sam about how that may emerge. I also think that Russia is the least rational of the actors in this scenario, and it's so much of this is driven by Putin's need to continue to keep Russia on a war footing. Otherwise, he faces a reckoning at home. But that's not to in any way to downplay what would happen in the event of a Taiwan contingency, because the global impact of a Taiwan contingency would dwarf even a potential conflict in Europe.
So, Sam, we're getting to the stage where we're all beginning to think now, at least the West is beginning to talk about this where we weren't a year or two or three ago. So that's your experiences. I think that's ours as well on this podcast, talking to various different people. But what do we need to do more to prepare for it? Because talking and recognising isn't enough, isn't it? What do we need to do over this next year to get all our ducks in order, us, the liberal West, for the polycrisis that may or may not hit in 2027?
There's two main options. Number one is to have a policy, a strategy of deterrence. In other words, stop China moving on Taiwan and stop Russia moving on Eastern Europe. The problem with that is that I think that it's very hard to see, with all those strategic issues in mind, why China would not move on Taiwan. And we also know that Taiwan is refusing because of its political dilemmas at home. Basically, they can't increase its defence budget because the opposition just won't allow it. It can't change its energy mix because the opposition won't allow it. And this means that Taiwan is very, very vulnerable to a quarantine. It has about 11 days of LNG, and about half of its energy mix comes from LNG. It has a few months of food, but at the end of the day, it is really hard to see Taiwan being able to survive.
I get that point, but we're not just observers in this. We are powerful nations here in the liberal West. We're America, Europe, NATO. We're not just victims of fate and destiny. There is more we can do to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, a Russian invasion of Estonia. Surely.
Yes, you're right. There is a lot more that we could do, but where is the political will to do it? I'm sure if you're sitting there as a military and a strategic planner, you would reinforce Taiwan with Western armies. And you would massively stockpile their energy and their food and make sure that any time that China moved in, then there would be skin in the game from the West, because people, in the same way that Britain moved a battalion, a mild regiment, in fact, to Estonia to make sure that there was skin in the game there. But we're not going to see that. No one's willing to put boots on the ground and to really reinforce Taiwan. Then we go to Russia. Yes, there are massive things happening. I saw that Estonia is building this new wall, and countries have reinforced the military on the front line there, whether it's in Romania or in the Baltics, etc. But again, all we need is for Russia to move 100 yards into that territory. I think that is the issue. How do you actually reduce the threat to the minute detail? And that is hard. So I think that the deterrent side is really, really difficult. So the other strategic option we've got is basically building out resilience for as and when the balloon goes up. And that is really what was happening in 1938, 39. Chamberlain massively increased aircraft production, knowing that it was very unlikely he was going to be able to put off Hitler forever. We should be doing the same. And that involves a lot of hard choices. Now, you've both spoken about the fiscal choices that need to be made. I would argue that we need to make those fiscal choices now and actually prepare properly for a potential conflict, because the economic and the military impact will be devastating. But if we start now and we start stockpiling critical minerals to make sure that our submarines can continue to be repaired, we start stockpiling properly big amounts of at the corporate level, computers and all the other elements that are needed to keep the companies going at times of geopolitical issue, trauma. And then working together with our allies to reinvent the supply chains of critical minerals and all these things. In other words, to have a whole of nation approach to preparing for this, and a whole of allied nation approach as well. But I don't see either one happening, even though the writing's certainly on the wall.
All right. Well, that is the work that needs to be done in this year, 2026, isn't it? As we laid out at the start. So, Sam, let me put you a very direct question to you. You just said a really interesting word. You said not if the bubble goes up, but when the bubble goes up, we need to be prepared for it. Are we going to be ready as soon as 2027? And will a polycrisis hit us next year? And if you can possibly put your money where your mouth is here and do that thing that all of us commentators hate doing and calling it, what's going to happen?
Yes, it is not a prediction, it is a scenario. But I see the scenarios that we've discussed very likely rolling out in 26, 27, 28. Now, the other question is, how can we be ready?
So very likely 80%, 60%, 90%?
Oh, 80%.
80%?
Yeah, I mean, from China and Taiwan, I know there are people that disagree with this, and that's good to have this disagreement because it forces us to check our analysis more carefully. But if the AI race and the AGI and ASI issues are really coming to the fore, which they are, and you see, for example, AGI being announced in America, which is highly likely, as I'm told by many people, next year, then it all brings the role of Taiwan very much into the fore in the minds of Beijing's planners. And there are loads of other reasons which I go into the paper about why we think China really wants to move about then. But as soon as that happens, then that is when the polycrisis starts. But then equally, it could be that Russia sees the window of opportunity and moves on Eastern Europe in the next few years, because all the things that we have said boil down to this: there is a window of opportunity for both countries in the next few years to move where before the West is ready to be able to push back properly. And why would you not take advantage of that when their strategic aims of both countries is the undermining of the West and the Western-led order?
So, Sam, I hear you, and I also doff my uneducated journalistic cap to your far greater knowledge and strategic understanding. But I'm not as pessimistic as you, and I think there's a lot of reasons why actually we can go into 2026 a bit more hopeful that we're going to be in the right place by the end of the year to see off this polycrisis. So for me, the polycrisis feels, 30, 40%. And there's a good 7 reasons which I've written about. I won't bore you with all of them. But the biggest for me is Europe, NATO, we are stepping up. I mean, look at where we were at the start of 2025. We were nowhere. The Trump presidency came along, everybody panicked, everybody started reinvesting in their militaries, the German military growing exponentially, the French investing. We're even beginning to invest ourselves here in Britain, but we could go a lot faster. So just think where we will be at the end of a whole nother year of this now that we have woken up. That leaves me feeling a lot more positive than perhaps you might be. But the second one is economic, and I really wanted to sort of challenge you on this one. Russia's economy is going badly pear-shaped very, very quickly. Their oil sales and gas sales are down dramatically, not because of the sanctions, because of all the Ukrainian missiles piling into Russian oil plants. They're down 20%, 27% year on year. They're in real trouble. Inflation rocketing, people getting very upset in Moscow economically. And also the Chinese economy. Their growth is flatlining. Their growth is going to be below 5%, we think, by the end of 2025, when we get the numbers, and certainly next year. The Chinese simply don't need a global crisis to screw their growth any further. Because if they do, it's the one simple thing that's going to stop their 1.2 billion people from keeping the CCP in power. And my feeling is they're just not going to want to risk it.
And on that, Tom, just to chuck in, the US Census Bureau published its annual report, and the projections on human population, the global population, are really interesting. As far as it concerns China, current population of 1.4 billion is projected by 2100, so less than a century from now, to have dropped to 662 million. And the assessment is that no matter what they do about it, that's irreversible.
So what's your pushback to my pushback, if you like, on why on earth China would want to risk destabilizing the global economy so badly, which could be potentially absolutely cataclysmic to the survival of the Chinese Communist Party?
It's a very good question, and it's one that's asked a lot. But this makes the assumption that China thinks like the West in terms of its of the position of its economic strength. We know that very boring, but China has 16 different categories of national security, and the top one is in a pyramid shape, like a sort of a champagne pyramid. And the top one is political stability, and the ones below it are military and economic stability, and they both exist to support political stability. So on one side, you could be right. However, I would bring us back to a man called General Galtieri from 1982, when the Argentinian economy was going wrong. He didn't say, I'm going to reach out for détente with the West. I'm actually going to launch an invasion of some small islands just off the coast. And I think that for me, understanding the first of all, that the economy and economic strength is not necessarily something that Xi puts a lot of interest in. He's not an economist. He's much more a political leader. But he also reckons that the economy sits there to support the political ambitions of him and the rest of the CCP. And so if it was considered that actually the economy was less important than the political ambitions, then certainly that's the direction they would take. And I think that the political ambitions and the political imperative of taking Taiwan would override that. And I've already mentioned those. Number one is that Xi is absolutely determined to win back Taiwan because of his political legacy and all the other reasons. But secondly, and this is super important, the AI question. If they don't win the AI race and the fourth industrial revolution that the AI race is a huge part of, and they let America win that means that China cannot achieve its 2049 goals, its political goals of being basically a great power, because America will win that. And so therefore, that is why I think that they would be willing to risk. And if they weren't willing to put the economy at risk, then why would they have spent many years now of developing, I think, the world's best economic defences? They've got 2 years of fuel supplies. They've been stockpiling things left, right and centre. They've been really rolling out export controls to make sure that their enemies are not particularly strong, and innovation, mercantilism, trying to destroy the ability for other countries to compete against them economically and industrially. So all these things point to them being ready to take the hit, but making sure that the political side is more important than the economic side.
And on the AI race, which absolutely China and the US are absolutely locked in now, who can win and dominate, because it's going to be so important. Your point being China taking back control of Taiwan would take back control of all that massive semiconductor production and make it extremely hard for anyone else in the world to develop much further with AI, let alone win that AI race.
Correct.
Okay, that's not a bad argument. I still cannot see any leader in the world wanting to commit economic and possibly regime suicide by doing that. But
it wouldn't
I hear
be
your
regime
pushback.
Suicide. It wouldn't be. So
Sam, it would be if the Chinese people rise up. Those 1.1 billion
They
Chinese.
wouldn't do it. So
well, they don't have a vote. If they don't get their cars and their growth, they're going to be unhappy bunnies, and they're going to start challenging authority.
So Tom, first of all, we already see thousands and thousands of protests in China every year. And so this is something that they're used to. Secondly, the Communist Party, by all accounts, is incredibly popular, because it's giving them back what the Chinese Communist Party have told the people they want, and the people generally do want, and have wanted for thousands of years, which is to see China at the centre of the world. And living standards have increased massively over last few decades. And yes, there will be people chuntering in the middle classes and people saying that they don't particularly, like the way things are going. And we see that from some of the polling in the last few years. But at the end of the day, that's all very well. But A, they don't have a vote, and B, the domestic surveillance and domestic security apparatus of China is the biggest in the world. And they spend far more on their domestic security than they do even on their normal defense budget. And their defense budget is probably almost the same as the American defense budget. So if you really go into the details, so therefore. It is incredibly hard to see how this would happen. Now, there may be an argument that if she screws this up, then they would probably get rid of him in a palace coup, because that's happened before in China. But this is why I think that a quarantine is far more likely than an invasion, because a quarantine you can have your cake and eat it. They would basically they put out the coast guards to around the 6 to 8 or so main ports of Taiwan, and basically then it would have to be the Americans or the Japanese as well, having to basically break that quarantine. And all our analysis shows that strategically, America cannot win a war against China for last more than a week or two, simply because America's military supply chain relies on China, and therefore China would emerge the strategic winner, and therefore this is something that would be given to the people as a victory. And so, yes, they would have a few issues about, economic hardship, but this is something they've been through and they're being prepared for now by years and years of telling them that hardship is fine if we emerge victorious at the end. And that's what we think that they would do if America fell into their trap.
Patrick, I'm really tempted to get you to give a percentage. I'm going to elevate my Polycrisis percentage chances from 30% to 45% with Sam's excellent pushbacks. What are your percentage chances of a Polycrisis and us being ready for it come 2027?
I struggle slightly with the time frame, and I buy all of Sam's arguments. I don't think it undermines Sam's central point or indeed the validity of the scenarios. I just think that time is a bit more elastic. So I think we're looking at a decade of living dangerously between 2027, which I think is when it starts, and around about 2035 is the period of maximum danger, and that's what we've got to negotiate. But I do agree with Sam's analysis that if you were Russia or China, and you were thinking strategically as opposed to opportunistically, you would not wait for Europe to rearm. And so the faster we move, the safer we're going to be in terms of deterring conflict. So percentage-wise, I think that within that decade, I think it's a sort of 60, 70% chance that we're going to face one or more of these scenarios.
I think what we all agree is that 2026 is going to be a hell of a year. It's going to be the start, or the continuation at least, of this big build-up for us to prepare ourselves for or deter, and an awful lot's going to happen. But to arm ourselves a little bit better for getting through this absolutely fascinating next year, what have you guys read over the Crimbo holidays that you found particularly enlightening or helpful for listeners to get us through the next sort of year or so on this sort of thinking? Sam, what would you recommend?
From a non-fiction point of view, if you want to have a bit more of an understanding of the realities of where we are, How the War Was Won by Phillips O'Brien is incredibly good analysis of the Second World War, and talks about a lot of the things that are relevant to today because of the focus on industrial capabilities and things that we need to get to grips with. So I certainly recommend that. But I think that on a fiction side, I think often in dark days, we need to turn to fiction to be able to really escape and go into a different world. And anyone that hasn't read the Slow Horses books really needs to go into those, because they are such a bit of an escapism, make you smile and make you realise that actually there can be other things on your mind rather than just geopolitical problems.
Well, you're talking to two Slow Horses fans here, that's for sure. Patrick, what can you?
So I'm going to go with three. I'm going to go with two fiction and one non-fiction. So the non-fiction, which is I guess the most important book, the one that actually I keep coming back to I've read over the last 3 or 4 years, is called The Lessons of Tragedy by Charles Adel and Hal Brand, and it's a brilliant analysis of the sense of contemporary amnesia and the lack of awareness of what could befall us, what could happen, and seeks to draw on Greek tragedy as a means of unpacking how you go about reawakening populations as to how to avert tragedy. So that one. On thriller, the best, I recommend this to everybody. The best thriller I've ever read is called Kalimsky Heights by Lionel Davidson. It's an absolute brilliant book. And then for a laugh, you could do no better than P.G. Wodehouse.
Well, my list is tiny because by the time everyone's got through those two wonderful long lists, it'll be the summer holidays anyway. On geopolitics, I would massively recommend the essay Alexander Stubb wrote for the Foreign Affairs magazine in November. Stubb is, of course, the president of Finland. Just a beautifully eloquent exposition of where we are and what we need to do. And his basic argument was, much as we've been talking about, the world for the next 50 to 100 years is going to be defined in the next 5 years. For fiction and light relief and also a bit of optimism and a little bit of jingoism every now and then, although he may be not quite too PC anymore, I would always turn to Flashman. And surely you two would agree with that.
Yeah,
I'm giving Flashman to all my godchildren this year.
When you went into the Afghan intelligence center that we created during the Afghan campaign, as you walked in, there was a copy of the original Flashman book, so the first one, which is all about Afghanistan, and it's framed behind a glass case, and it says "break in case of emergency." Well, that's it for this week. And Sam, thank you so much for joining us for a second time. And I'm sure that we'll be asking you to come back on again. And for anybody who hasn't read it, do go to Sam's excellent Substack called States of Play, and also his Polycrisis 2027 paper from Sibylline. They are well worth the read. Sam, if I don't see you again, I probably won't because you're in Wiltshire and I'm about to be in Australia. Happy New Year, Sam.
And Happy New Year to you all, and I wish you a good 2026.
Absolutely. Happy New Year, Sam, and I hope things go a little bit better than you exponentially, brilliantly described. Well, that is it for this week. As always, please send us your questions and comments. Anything you want to tell us, that's always enormously useful to receive. The email is generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. And one final thing we want to say is a very, very heartfelt and sad goodbye to our absolutely fantastic producer, Sophie, who's been with us almost from the start, the rock of the podcast, and is moving to different climes within Times Towers. But Sophie, you've been absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. We're going to miss you more than I can say.
So until next week, bye, Patrick.
Bye, Tom. And most of all, bye, Sophie.